Hello, I am Precious Thompson, and today we're going to be going over the analysis of comparative science. So, what is subjective science? Subjectivity in comparative science. We notice that subjectivity is personal judgment, opinions, and interpretations. Although subjectivity can lack proven data, it should not be frowned upon. It can be beneficial as it relates to forensic science, but some people prefer objectivity because objectivity will prove more data or will have more reliability or credibility than subjectivity. For an example, if a latent print examiner is looking at a fingerprint and a fingerprint could probably have a small smudge on it, that can prove unclear data. And so that's when subjectivity comes into play. As we looked at what is objectivity is data that is not being biased. It does have proven facts. It does have reliability, and you're able to verify it. That is why that this is more credible and useful as it relates to subjectivity. They both are actually used in forensic science, but objectivity can help eliminate errors in cases. And objectivity also allows for forensic experts to not only depend on objectivity, but to also back up subjectivity in most cases to determine a more concrete answer for the case. Here we can compare and contrast subjectivity and objectivity. Although they may have their own comparisons and contrasts, we can see that they both have a balanced human judgment and they both can minimize bias and minimize errors. It all just depends on their specific case and what they are dealing with. But we can see that subjectivity does lack clear data, while objectivity has a more variable facts and measurables, and it can reproduce a higher end of results. So now we're going to be looking at the three logics in comparative science. The three logic in comparative science is your deduction logic, abduction logic, and induction logic. So as we look at our deduction logic, it involves applying a general principle to a case to determine the conclusion. The conclusion must logically flow within the case to actually determine the deduction log. For an example, if we have a tool mark that has a unique pattern that matches the tool, we can conclude that that tool made the unique pattern. So the deduction logic is just determining that, hey, this came from this specific tool mark. And now that we see that it has come from this tool mark, we can determine that that tool has come from that specific tool mark. And that is what deduction logic is. Deduction logic is used in forensic science, especially during training, because this allows for trainees and trainers to actually help determine examiners' basic logic. So you're able to understand the basic details of what it is in forensic science as it relates to comparative methods. As we look at our abduction logic is basically making a hypothesis on what they see. So as we look at abduction logic, you basically going off the evidence that you have present or that you may have in front of you. Like for an example, if a person's blood is found at a crime scene, we can make a hypothesis that someone could be potentially the suspect, even though they did not commit the crime. And that's why I kind of say that abduction logic can sometimes show different barrels as it relates to the details, because this can actually show that although I have this proven evidence here, we cannot make a concrete answer that is there because abduction logic has limited data. and you're making conclusion off of limited data. As we look at the induction logic allows us to be able to determine and provide a conclusion. So in induction logic, they look at all possible data, all possible evidence before determining. So for an example, if we're analyzing a fingerprint, we're making sure that we're not only just looking at the fingerprint, we're looking at more than one pattern. We're looking at the loops of the fingerprint, the ridges and the whorls of the fingerprint. We're looking at all possible causes before we make a determined answer or before we give an concrete answer about the case. So that is why induction logic allow us to be able to go over everything from start to finish to determine what could be the possible cause before we just make a definite answer. So for an example here, we can see that we have a fingerprint here. We can see that we have here in the first image to the left, we can see that we have loops there. But then when we look at the second image, we have another loop there. So this is how we can able to determine different logics as it relates to an image. So let's also take a look at this here. We have forms, patterns, and features that can contribute to unique characteristics. So when we think about form is how you create something, how something is formed. Form is the general shape. It is the blueprint. That's what I like to call it. It's a blueprint of the image. So the way the form contributes to uniqueness is by the size. It's how the form has for each object. So for an example, when we look at someone's fingerprint, we're looking at every aspect of the fingerprint. This is why we say that the form is the blueprint because we are basing everything off of that form. Although we look at different forms, the pattern can also come in and make a particular role within our form. So patterns add specific things to the form. Like for an example, if I have a fingerprint and then this fingerprint is like this, but then now the pattern has come in and added different things. So such as the loops, while features bring the image together as well, it brings it all together as within the pieces of the image. So, for an example, as it relates to form, pattern, and features, as it relates to the characteristics of those, they all play a role in the details of how images are viewed. Now, let's take a look at unnatural patterns and unique natural patterns. Unnatural patterns, we can always notice that unnatural patterns are humanly manufactured objects. They're not made from the earth. These are objects that have been created by someone else, and they have a low variability because although unnatural objects can be grouped, unnatural products or unnatural objects or patterns can lack different things. So when we look at an unnatural pattern, for an example, we can take a look at tire treads. Tire treads are not unique. There are a lot of manufacturers who make all types of tires, and all those tire tread patterns can be the exact same. As we look at natural patterns, they can be grouped together. So for an example, if we take a identical twins, although they are identical twins, their fingerprints are not the same. Everyone has a own unique fingerprint. Although they may be identical, their fingerprints are naturally, this is a natural pattern, but they do not have the same at all. And then what we also notice that although unnatural patterns and natural patterns may have their differences, they do have some similarities. They both are not permanent. They can they can be persistent or they can be durable, but the pattern can always change. So for an example, like we were saying before in the previous slide, that sometimes You may be looking at a fingerprint. The pattern can be destroyed, or it could have a smudge on it. So that's what we mean by the change of the pattern can be fast or it can be slow. It just really depends. But unnatural patterns and your new natural patterns, they do have their similarities based off of them not having a whole lot in common. As we take a look at expert judgment, how we can actually determine how two marks are originated from the same source. So when we think about judgment, we can relate this back to subjectivity and objectivity, because that is how we can also determine a source, because although subjectivity is allowing us to just be biased and allowing us to put our personal opinions inside of a case, as it relates to objectivity, we're also able to determine that as well, because they both have that judgment in there. And as we look at having to determine a judgment or from the same source, we can also go back and depict on the different patterns or the different forms of features that we see from an image or that we see from an object to actually determine that source. And looking at expert judgment, we can see that it's a part of science, but without having judgment, that's why I say subjectivity comes a role in here too, because they kind of tie in together as well. Because without science, there is no judgment. So we need judgment, we need subjectivity. That's why I say do not have subjectivity to be frowned upon, because we can always create a different aspect of what someone else may or may not catch. Now let's take a look at the levels of details in the image. So previously in this class, we have looked at this on all different aspects. As we look at the first level of the detail in the image, I believe that this is like the main foundation. This is the blueprint. This is how we able to determine the second and the third levels, because the second and the third level always sometimes or can always rely on the first level detail. The first level detail is generally like the shapes, the sizes, the dimensions, so that way we can actually determine the source of the image. While it does not offer sameness, we can see that it is the foundation. As we look at second level details is where the patterns start to form into this. So, for an example, we can have that first level detail image, but we can also start adding different things onto that first level detail. But like I stated before in one of my discussion posts, is that do we think that the third level detail can be necessary if the first level detail lacks quality and quantity? Third level details allow us to be able to determine the source. So that's why we always need to make sure that the first level detail image is the most important part, because that way we can actually determine the source by the third level of detail. And then here's my reference on where I got this information. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Precious Thompson, and thank you for listening in on my comparing analysis of comparative science.